Mr. President, why don't you have a seat? And what I'll do, since Mr. President, you were very nicely introduced, and we learned lots of things, and I had the pleasure of attending lunch with you today, and to realize that you are a living encyclopedia of Africa. I mean, you know everything about each corner of the continent. I was amazed, no? But I was planning to run our conversation in 3 different blocks, starting maybe with your biography and learning more how you got so engaged in the history of your country and Africa. And then I will ask you a number of questions that have to do with education, but also are embedded in your own biography. Then we will jump into an analysis of Africa and try to understand better the continent, mostly from an educational perspective. And finally, we will learn more about your own university, where you are the chancellor. What are your plans? What is the vision for the future at your university? So let me start by asking something which is more personal. You were the son of a couple of professors, is that correct? Is there anything genetic in your dedication to higher education? Because I'm sure that if we ask around the audience, we will find that many of us have professors actually as our ancestors, no? But how much did that environment influence your education, your early years?
Well, no, thanks, Mr. President. No, my parents were professors in the sense of being teachers. No, we grew up we grew up with books at home. So as soon as you could read, we started reading books. I think the first novel that I must have read, when I must have been about 8 years, 9 years old, was the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. So of course, as you can understand, an 8-year-old doesn't understand a word of it, but you read it nevertheless. And I remember reading 14 years, 15 years, Immanuel Kant, some book. So I'm saying that to see we grew up in a situation where learning and reading was kind of natural. So all the time you want to learn more, ask more, you want more. I went to boarding school at the age of 13. And the Lovedale, the boarding school, had a very, very big library, a very big bookshop, because the next door to us was a university, which didn't have a bookshop. So the school, high school, the boarding school had a bookshop, so the university students used to come there. So a very, very big bookshop. So there were 4 of us who were about 12, 13, and so we formed a small group. And we would always go to the bookshop late afternoon when it's about to close, because the staff that are selling books have thinned down because there's no more customers. So you might have 2 instead of 6. So we go there, 4 of us, and the task of 3 is to distract these shop assistants. You do something. And the 4th one is to steal books. So that's what we used to do. So I'm saying it was part of the process of accessing knowledge.
No, it's very important. I guess we actually educate ourselves very intensely in the early years. And I was wondering, and it was actually essential in your case. But if we move to later years, when you join the University of Sussex, you go to the UK. Then you become an activist. You join politics there. And let me, link this with a comment of the Directora General Pilar Garcés, who before she said, she suggested that universities should engage in politics in terms of transforming the environment for the better, no? So my question is, should university students become activists? Because this was very frequent, in the 60s. It was frequent also at some other stages in different countries. Now I guess we also see activism in the US currently as regards the Me Too movement, for example. But I was wondering whether you think that university students should actually be very active in terms of embracing political causes or some other, social options.
Oh yes, no. I think it's very important that young people at universities should be concerned about more than the books, about the society in which they live and the society towards which they aspire, and seek to change it. So I think it's important to have an activist student population. I think because it tells you that here you are producing people from this university who are more interested than in, I want to be a doctor in order to get a good job, in order to get a status or whatever. But you are producing an intellectual who's also engaged with the human condition. I think the activism is important.
Of course, in your case, it was more than justified, given that you were actually leading the youth group of the ANC in the UK, which was actually a vital place in order to gather all the efforts and transform your country for the better. No, I still recall the entrance of the South Africa embassy there on Trafalgar Square, which was gathered by many demonstrators, no, at that time. So what are your memories of that, of those years, no? Which I guess were very intense. You were combining your studies with your engagement in ANC and in transforming your country. If you could pick, one or two memories, I guess you were also in very close contact with the leaders, particularly with Nelson Mandela, who has become actually an icon of our times, no? So if you could pick, one or two memories of those years, and maybe from Mandela himself, what could you share with us, given that we have here, the audience composed of university representatives, no?
Well, Mr. President, the period you talk about outside, when I was in England, of course, Mandela and the others were already in jail. But I'll say something about that before that. But this was an important period, of course, for us, South African, because it was a period when we had to help to develop this global movement against apartheid. And so the activization of people in all of these countries, in the UK, in Spain, and everywhere else, to demonstrate against apartheid, to mount that kind of pressure, to isolate the apartheid regime, that was very, very important work that had to be done. So even as university students, we had to be involved in that. You'd remember that around that time, like late 60s, there developed in Europe a very strong Vietnam solidarity movement. I'm mentioning that because we linked up with this Vietnam solidarity movement. A lot of mobilization of students in Western Europe around like the struggle in support of the Vietnamese people, but they readily saw the need to link with the struggle in South Africa. So these were two movements, but in fact they worked together. So, people like Rudy Dutschke, you remember Rudy Dutschke? These are the sorts of people that would be sort of partners. We are pursuing the South African struggle, they are leading. They were in the 1968 student movement, but also took on causes like this. So it was a very important period, and I think it reinforced, consolidated world unity around particular good things. To unite the students of Europe, for instance, in the struggle against racism, and so on. So it was very, very important. With regard to Nelson Mandela and his others, the ANC in 1961, the ANC gets banned in 1960. It's an illegal organization. In 1961, it takes a decision to send students to study outside South Africa. And the argument was that sooner or later, well, never mind our difficulties today, sooner or later South Africa is going to be liberated, and we are going to need this cadre of educated people to come and help us manage a democratic South Africa. So we must prepare them. So the first echelon of students were sent out were in 1961. By which time Nelson Mandela was already underground, running away from police arrests. And so he insisted. He was hiding and moving from house to house, place to place, but insisted that he needed to see the students before they leave. So it was arranged, and we managed to see him with some of the students. And really all he wanted to say was, you people, you must go and study and succeed, because you are going to be needed here to build the South Africa, number one. And number two, you must remember that you are South African ambassadors. The rest of the world knows about the apartheid ambassadors. You are different kinds of ambassadors. So you must represent the South Africa that is to be born, not the present one. And so that very first batch left with that mission, to be ambassadors and to succeed. And I think 90% of them lived up to that task.
No, it's fascinating. And then you became also one of the leading negotiators in order to facilitate the transition in your country. I guess if I think of peaceful transitions in the world in recent times, I can mention maybe the case of Spain, which is of course also a peaceful transition. But the way, President Mandela and people like you conducted the whole process, and the praise of Ubuntu, I mean reconciliation among the different members of society is something which is exemplary, and remains actually as a reference for any civilized society in order to achieve higher grounds of development. Then you become president after Mandela, and during your mandate, actually your country experiences the longest standing economic growth after World War II. So congratulations, this is amazing. No? And but allow me to ask you something related to one of your speeches that has become a classical, I'm an African, which is actually a speech that I recommend to all participants. Is actually available on the web, which is a poem. It's very lyrical, it's fantastic. And I was wondering, what did you have in mind at that time? This was 1996, when you addressed this speech in front of the assembly, which is gathered in order to write a new constitution for your country. So which values did you have in mind? Of course, it's a very evocative poem, and you address many different things: the rule of law, equality, diversity, many things that are very important also to educators, no? But what did you want to achieve, no, with this discourse that has been actually put in parallel with some other, leading speeches by Martin Luther King and others, no?
Well, the occasion was the adoption of the Constitution. It was the adoption. And the different, Nelson Mandela had to speak there as President of the Republic. Then the political parties that are members of the Constitutional Assembly then had to speak. So I had to speak for the ANC. So I mean, the occasions like that are challenging in this sense. That you say, it is not every day that you adopt constitutions. And consequently, you can't make an everyday speech. This is one of these rare occasions, and you got off to rise up to it and speak in a way that is extraordinary. It's obvious. It's obvious. You can't, on the adoption of a constitution, you can't speak as though it make the same speech that you made yesterday. I think it's natural. So, I mean, this was anyway my thinking. So now, and then we're adopting this constitution. Well, let me just divert a little bit. I was in exile for something like 28 years. And then we agree with the South African government that we must negotiate. So a group of ours, from us, flies to South Africa from Lusaka, Zambia. And South African government say they will send a plane to pick us up. And President Kaunda of Zambia says, you can't do that because you're already showing that you are weak, that they pick you up because you don't have your own wings to get there. So I'll give you a plane. So we flew down back to South Africa in a Zambia Airways plane and landed in Cape Town. They had sort of emptied the airport. So, but immigration and so on, we land there, and so very few people except our hosts, and they took us to the hotel. And that was all. Now this is after an absence of 28 years. But it was very easy, very simple. You land, like you're landing here in Madrid, get off the plane, walk through some customs, and to the hotel. So I think to myself, no, but why did we have to wait for 28 years and have so many people killed for this easy thing? This thing could have been done. So I'm saying at the end of all of that comes this constitution, which is for people coming out of that conflict with all the pain and everything else, and the prejudices. Because white South Africa proceeds from the position that we are, you remember the white South Africans call themselves Europeans. Europeans until I think the 1980s or 1990s. And so public, when there's this apartheid segregation, the benches are European and non-white. With the notion that we as Europeans are superior and these black ones are subhuman. Now it's these Europeans and the subhumans who get together to produce the constitution. An excellent constitution. So that's why in that speech I say that this is a product of African hands and African minds. To make the point that it's not a subhuman product. It's not even an European product. It's an African product. So it's to celebrate this creation by that kind of combination, but also to make a commitment that as Africans, we have an obligation to be loyal to these things that we say in this constitution, whether it's rule of law or whatever. but you had to say it in a manner that makes an impact on the hearts and minds of the people who are listening.
This actually brings us very naturally to the second part of our conversation, which is actually your vision on Africa. You are probably one of the leading figures in promoting Pan-Africanism, and we were discussing earlier this morning, about the need of projecting and building up an image of Africa that is actually developed in Africa and not the other way around. No? I mean, you were talking about your being the ambassadors of South Africa when you were studying overseas. But now what we need is actually to understand better the African culture and have a vision from within, right? At the same time, we are attending an Africa Renaissance. And I realize that you have a project which is a very ambitious one, but I would like you maybe to share that project with this audience, because it has to do a lot with universities and higher education, no? Could you maybe, I mean, this idea, if I may, drop, we were discussing over lunch, about regional integration, and you have been involved in many different initiatives in Africa. And now you are actually leading the creation of a Pan-African University or a Pan-African higher education program, no? In fact, I told you that I believe that in Europe, the Erasmus program that you are very familiar with has probably been more effective in integrating Europe than the Euro itself, because it has provided many people from different countries to move cross-border and learn from other cultures and other countries. So if you're actually able to develop something similar in Africa, and I realize that you have something similar in mind, no? That you may share with us if you like.
Yes, Mr. President, what we were talking about was indeed, as you say, the development of a Pan-African, what is called a Pan-African University. And driven by various considerations, which are in a sense obvious, that as Africans, we do indeed need access to this higher education. Number two, we don't have the resources to build these higher education institutions in the numbers that are required in each country. But since we are all African together, common identity, common interests, common destiny, why don't we cooperate to address this need to develop this intelligentsia using the resources that we have? All right, so what do? Let's then have a Pan-African University. But in fact, it's not a university. You put up buildings or get buildings somewhere, and it's one university. It's actually an association of universities. It's a network with tasks allocated to different universities. So I was saying, for instance, one of the universities in South Africa, University of Stellenbosch, then within this, it's like a set of colleges. The University of Stellenbosch has the task to teach, to be the center of excellence, with regard to teaching space science and all of that. So that then all African students who want to study space science must have easy access to the University of Stellenbosch. So that if the South African government says, this is our visa regime for visitors, you got to waive it in order to facilitate that access by students, teachers, everybody, to access this one center of excellence. Because it is no longer a South African center of excellence. It's an African center of excellence. So it must be available to the continent. And so that's what has happened, that various subjects, as it were, have then been allocated to different universities around the continent. So you go to University of Nairobi for another subject, and then go to a university in Algiers for another. This is a network of universities that constitute the PanAfrican University. And it's a very important initiative because then you don't have to get out of the continent to get the highest level of access to knowledge and training in that kind of center of excellence. Because there are these centers of excellence on the continent, which might not be centers of excellence with regard to all subjects, but in particular chosen subjects. They've got that. So I'm saying it helps to give the continent the kind of access to higher education that is required.
No, which is a very fascinating project, and I was going to ask you also what elements can be brought from the experiences at some other universities in Europe or in the US, because we were talking actually over lunch about the potential growth in Africa. As you all probably know, just considering Nigeria, the growth of the population in the coming years is going to pass the whole growth of Europe. Rafael Pujol, professor here, who's a specialist in demographics, knows about this very well. And so just considering, that one of the biggest countries in Africa is going to pass the population of an entire continent, and the potential across the rest of the countries in Africa, we all realize that probably the next frontier and the future of higher education is actually in your continent. I guess we have to reinvent, using the same expression that gives title to the conference. We have to reinvent the way we deliver higher education. We probably need to design cost-effective operations because budgets there are thin. There are no endowments if we compare universities there. That happens also in Europe as well, no? But there's a number of distinctive features that probably require to develop a different model of university in Africa as compared to other continents, right?
Well, it may not be, yeah, maybe. But clearly what is happening on the continent, and it's been like this for some years, basically higher education at this level is underfunded. It's obvious. And the universities are understaffed. Understaffed in this sense that you then get a university lecturer who has to attend to a very big class. The student population on the African continent has grown in a period of maybe 12 years from something like 400,000 to over 10 million in a short time. The resources devoted to education haven't caught up with that. That includes resources in order to hire teaching staff. Also has an impact on research, because this teacher is so busy with the students, so many of them, no space to do research. Now this pressure about underfunding, understaffing, and as I was saying, you see this very rapid growth in the intake of students, the massification of students, of universities. All these processes happen at the same time. What's happening in the South African case is that a lot of the university, well, let me not say a lot, a number of the universities have actually started having distance learning interventions. So you might find that perhaps even 30% of the student population, or 40, is not resident, but it's in a distance learning. It's to cope with these numbers, because obviously distance learning, open distance learning like our university, UNISA, is much cheaper, much more affordable, even to the student. So I think in order to take on board the massification of the universities, the inadequacy of funding, pressure on teachers, the distance learning model becomes important, and therefore the uses of technology. The uses of technology to do this. And I think the African continent can avoid this because it doesn't have the capacity to build the sorts of institutions like any university that has got classrooms and lecture rooms and this and the other, to be able to respond to the demand for higher education in the context of this limitation of resources.
It's very interesting, I mean, your comments, and distance learning, of course, can play a leading role in the forms of delivery of future programs of higher education in Africa. If I have some figures which is interesting to share with the audience, 5%, only 5% of the population in Africa attends university as compared to the average of 25% elsewhere at other continents. So there's a potential, a room for growth, which is very amazing. And then I was looking at the number of private universities as compared to public universities. It seems that the number of private universities is actually double the number of public ones, no? And then, of course, there's a good number of online and distance learning operations in place, no? But you were mentioning the scarcity of professors. I'm sure that this is actually a common problem to all of us. And if I ask our rector, Salvador Carmona, I'm sure that he will probably share, you know, the same concern with you, because it's not easy to find the sort of professors that we all look for. I was telling you this morning, I call them kangaroos, because they are not just gurus, people who produce wise knowledge. They need to be good professors and jump from there in order to interface with the professions and top management. So how can we actually, I wonder whether you have discussed about this problem with your colleagues at UNISA, and this brings us, you know, to your vision for your own university, which is playing a leading role in South Africa and in the continent. But how can we envision, you know, responding to this very tough demand of having the right faculty, the right professors teaching in our classes, and at the same time being prepared? I mean, is there any way where we can actually work together, the different presidents and rectors who are present here?
Yes, I mean, there is a general problem in the South African universities. I'm glad to hear that it's not unique to us. The general problem, this one that you are raising, of these professors and so on, people at a certain level, people with PhDs and so on. So there's a lot of discussion about this. That it is not, let me just talk about our university, University of South Africa. So a decision was taken that therefore we have got to go out of the way to prepare people to join the teaching staffs. So we must have monies and processes and everything else that's necessary to make sure people get master's degrees and PhDs and so on. But also make sure that there's no requirement that you should get those higher qualifications at UNISA. So they can come here to IE, we will still pay, in the hope that these persons who then get these higher degrees will come back and join the teaching staffs. But even if they don't, they add to the kind of people that are required in society anyway. So UNISA runs a program like that, is to try and replenish this teaching staff. There's a particular South African problem in that context, which is that historic, because of the history of South Africa, your senior staff, your professors and all that, will be I don't know, 85% white. So you got this challenge in South Africa of the deracialization of that echelon, which means you got to bring more black people into that kind of grade. So you can't ignore it. You can't say we're going to put it off until tomorrow. Because you say, but this is an untransformed university. It still remains an apartheid university. So you got to engage that issue. Plus, second element of that problem, this top echelon of teachers are getting old. They need to be replaced anyway. And so we can't avoid the responding to this challenge by having specific programs to train new teachers. It's a challenge. The South African universities, all of them have addressed this thing. And certainly at UNISA, we have quite a very strong program to make sure that in all these disciplines, the university has got 8 colleges, law, economic sciences, engineering. So in all of these disciplines, to make sure that there is a process to reproduce the PhDs and so on, so that you have this teaching staff.
So you have your own PhD program at your university as
yeah.
well, right?
As well, yeah.
Your university is probably the leading higher education institution in Africa in distance learning, right? In terms of number of participants, number of students. And I guess that you envision distance learning and technology-based education as probably the future for programs, the delivery of programs in Africa in the future, right?
Yes, I mean, it's a very big institution. It's got about 400,000 students. The majority of them are on the African continent. An important section of them, of course, is South African, but the university has got a footprint on the continent in about 36 African countries, but then has students everywhere else. I even learned today that it's got students in Spain, it's got students in the US, in the UK, in Australia, they are all over the place. But altogether, the student population is about 400,000. It's the biggest institution on the continent, and one of the biggest distance learning things in the world. But it's bound to grow. It has to grow.
That's very impressive. Could you share with us also some other avenues for development at your university that you envision for the future? Because you mentioned distance learning, the need of identifying the proper faculty. Is there any other tough challenge that you have to face where maybe collaboration with other higher education institutions can provide some solution?
Yes, no, it is. There are challenges of that kind because we are that distance learning institution with this footprint on the continent. You have to, if I just give you an example of the problem. Ethiopia, some years back, in fact 10 years ago, the Ethiopian government approached the university to say, we need to train these high-level intellectuals, masters and PhDs. Can you, University of South Africa, institute a program to deal with this? So university agreed, and we agreed with the government and so on. It was actually the government of Ethiopia and the university. So we launched the program and very successful, ultimately. Because the problem was that a lot of these are PhD students, Ethiopian, that were at some point after the emperor of Ethiopia was killed, Haile Selassie, and Mengistu Haile Mariam took over. They insisted on using Amharic as a medium of instruction from primary to university. So when the University of South Africa now must start this PhD course, let us say, in Ethiopia. Then the students, master's degrees have already applied, accepted, and they start working. They can't write their papers because they don't know English, and our university uses English, the medium of instruction, because they know Amharic. So we had to partner with the British Council to say to the British Council, they must then take on the task in Ethiopia of teaching the students competence in the English language so that they can then do these PhD courses at UNISA. It's peculiar problems like that. That you say you are an African university with this Pan-African footprint, but then you are going to inherit students who come from different backgrounds. You don't want to turn them away, but you got to find a way of responding to the challenge that they pose. I'm saying in the Ethiopian case, highly educated people, very competent in Amharic, and competent as they have proved once they could master the English, very competent at getting PhDs. But you had to deal with the language issue in order to play this role of an African university. So I'm saying this phenomenon will express itself from country to country in different ways. It's a particular challenge.
Absolutely. Let me just finalize by asking you maybe to provide us some message of hope. I mean, going back to Pilar Garcés' words before, no, she was actually referring to how we have changed the title of the conference in just 7 years. 7 years ago, globalization seemed unstoppable. Now we are all, wondering whether trade is going to be under threat. Populism, nationalism, anti-global moves. So from your perspective, could you actually share with us some words of hope in case you guess that, we can actually trust that the future, the best is yet to come? Mm-hmm.
No, the words of hope would be, I think that you should follow the African example. Because the sentiment on the continent is quite the opposite. I agree entirely with what she was saying. The sentiment on the continent is pro-globalization. Even the African universities, in their discussion, they want better cooperation with universities globally. So on an equal basis and all of that, sharing researchers and facilities and all this. The sentiment on the continent is that starting with the continent itself, the only way we can make a success of ourselves as individual countries, African, is if we act together in cooperation, in unity. Starting point. That gets extended to the rest of the world. We would also want to be part of the rest of the world on a base of equality, because it's only in that context that we're going to succeed as humanity. So, there's many things that we don't have time. If you go around the continent, some of the things that as Africans we don't understand, we looking from afar. One of the things we see is tensions in Europe around Ukraine. And then sanctions are imposed, and there's all sorts of crises. And the Africans are asking themselves the question, what's wrong with the Europeans? I mean, really, why don't they talk to one another and resolve this thing? But everybody's got the spears out. I'm saying the African sentiment would be, it is better that we cooperate because that's the only way we're going to succeed. If we don't cooperate, none of us will succeed. And so you can't have an anti-globalization sentiment. You have the quite the opposite. And I was saying that I think, President, maybe everybody should follow the African example.
Absolutely, and we should certainly, organize some conference in your country in the future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, President Mbeki, thank you.